What if the biggest threat to your strategy isn't the market, the competition, or even the economy, but the moment your team tries to execute it?
Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most strategies don't fail in the boardroom. They fail in the real world, quietly, slowly, and often long after leaders think the hard work is done.
Today, we're talking to someone who has lived that reality at Nike, Sur La Table, Borders, and Tower Records, and who just wrote the book on why execution breaks down and how to fix it.
Kevin Ertell joins us to unpack his new book, The Strategy Trap: Why Companies Fail at Execution and How to Get It Right. And trust us, this is the conversation every retail leader needs right now.
We get into the early warning signs that leaders miss, the myths that sound smart but collapse on contact with reality, and Kevin's 6 C's framework that finally connects strategy to actual results.
If you've ever watched a great idea stall out, fade away, or die in a postmortem, this episode is going to hit home. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the Retail Razor Retail Transformers podcast, part of the #1 indie podcast network for retail, and the show where we bring you candid conversations with the crazy ones, the rebels, the bold thinkers, and the disruptors that see things differently to shape the future of retail. I'm Ricardo Belmar.
And I'm Casey Golden. Welcome, Retail Razor fans and new listeners. Today's episode is one we've been excited about for a long time because we're tackling a problem every leader knows all too well, but very few talk about, honestly.
Strategy is easy to celebrate. Execution is where everything gets messy. And according to Harvard Business Review, 67% of well-crafted strategies fail, not because there were bad ideas, but because the execution fell apart.
Our guest today has spent more than 30 years in the trenches of retail execution. He's led teams and P&Ls at Nike, Sur La Table, Borders, and Tower Records. He's seen brilliant strategies succeed, and he's seen brilliant strategies crumble.
And now he's distilled all of that experience into a new book that's already making waves, The Strategy Trap: Why Companies Fail at Execution and How to Get It Right. Our guest is Kevin Ertell, founder and CEO of Mystère Advisory, where he helps leadership teams turn strategy into execution and execution into results. Now he adds author to his list of achievements.
This isn't a book of theory. It's a field guide. Kevin interviewed more than 60 operators across industries, representing over 1,000 years of operating experience to understand why execution breaks and how leaders can finally fix it.
We're going to talk about the traps leaders fall into, the early warning signs they miss, and Kevin's 6 C's framework that turns strategy from a slide deck into real behavior and real results.
We're all launching a new strategy this year, and if you're still trying to figure it out, why the last one didn't land, this conversation is going to give you the clarity and tools you need. But before we jump in, a quick ask for all of our amazing listeners and viewers. If you're enjoying the show, why not hit us with a 5-star rating and drop a short review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, or wherever you're listening.
And like and subscribe on our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. And if you haven't already, take a few minutes to check out and subscribe to the other shows in the Retail Razor Podcast Network, The Retail Razor Show, Blade to Greatness, and Data Blades. You'll find them all in your favorite podcast app and on our YouTube channel. Now let's get into it. Here's our discussion with our latest retail transformer, Kevin Ertell, author of The Strategy Trap: Why Companies Fail at Execution and How to Get It Right. Kevin, welcome to the Retail Transformers podcast. It's exciting to have you on the show. We've been so looking forward to this discussion for a while now. We've been talking about it, especially with your new book out. The timing just couldn't be better.
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you guys for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you on the show. I've been waiting for this discussion because your book is so needed in retail right now. So obviously, we're both fans. But for our audience who might not know your rich history in retail, before we dive into the conversation, why don't you just take a moment and give us a little bit of background?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been in retail pretty much my whole career. I started out literally as a sales clerk at Tower Records when I was 17 years old and worked my way up.
Wow.
Yeah, it was the greatest job ever.
Yeah.
And Tower was an amazing company because they believed in promoting within. I started as a clerk and I was there for 20 years and I left as a senior vice president.
Wow. Yeah.
So I got a chance to work my way up. And I was on the team. We built the first towerrecords.com. So back when, we were worrying about modem speeds and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I did that for a while. And then I moved on to Borders. At Borders, I ran the loyalty program and also borders.com. I spent a little bit of time on the solution provider side with 4C Results, where I ran a retail practice for them before going back into retail, CMO at Online Shoes. Then I went to Sur La Table, where I ran digital and marketing and technology, and then spent 7 years at Nike. So 3 roles at Nike, initially leading digital for the running category, then leading global digital operations. And then the last 3 years I was there, I led global retail operations. So actually kind of back on the store side of things. Full circle.
Wow. Yeah. Full circle.
And left 2 years ago and started Myster Advisory. And now I'm focused on working with companies on building executable strategies. As you mentioned, I wrote a book on that exact topic and doing some advising and coaching as well.
Fantastic. So no stranger.
No.
Right.
I didn't tell you how many decades, but it's a lot of them.
I think we're all beyond decades.
Yeah.
I think anybody talking about retail these days, we're all old.
You look amazing, though. I can't speak.
Thank you.
Right.
I'm petrified by Monster. Somehow did not break myself. Well, a shout out for getting Pantone, my back wall, getting it on their radar because I have a beautiful Pantone cup. Thanks to you.
Very nice.
My place smells like Cloud Dancer because they've got a beautiful fragrance. And I have Pantone Play-Doh.
Oh, wow.
That's awesome.
Okay.
I got so many treats. And so thank you. Keep on coming.
Very nice. Background on that. We were doing the prep for this and I saw Casey's wall and I took a picture and sent it to the president of Pantone, who I knew. She sent her a nice package. So that was awesome.
I got a beautiful package. It was so much fun. It was just a box full of surprises. These days when you get a package, we all know exactly what's in it because we ordered it.
Yes, we ordered it.
Sometimes we forget what we ordered.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
So it was a very nice surprise. Thank you.
Awesome. Amazing.
So let's dive in and talk about strategy versus execution and how this led to your new book, The Strategy Trap.
Yeah, Kevin, you famously, I think, said that most strategies fail later, not loudly. So what finally got motivated you to write this book about the strategy trap and how companies fail at the execution side of it, even when they have the best strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I've known for a while, and it's pretty common knowledge that most strategies fail, and the numbers on the data on that is really high. And the number one reason is poor execution. And so I've always been pretty good at that. I always wanted to focus on that. I've been very passionate about it. The funny thing is there's like 1 million books on how to write strategy, but not that many on execution.
Yeah.
And even the ones that are out there are mostly written by consultants and academics. So I wanted to write it from an operator's perspective, someone who's actually been there and done that. And I also didn't want it to only be my point of view. So I interviewed more than 60 people across all sorts of industries, company sizes, to try to get a really good picture of, hey, what are the things that actually work? And I tried to make the book as practical and as useful as possible so that it can actually sort of almost be a field manual for people so that you have techniques you can go apply right away and help, make execution happen on your side. So that was a motivation. I wanted to help reduce that terrible stat and see if we can get more strategies to be successful.
I mean, we've all heard the story of what happened with Starbucks when they hired, heavy consulting person to be the next CEO and tanked it. And what they do, brought in an operator.
Yeah.
Hey, when you've been there and you're in the nitty gritty, you understand what it really takes.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, that is where, I think it's overlooked. more so, that we need to go here for strategy rather than looking at the operators because they've got it.
Yeah. Right. It's amazing. It's amazing to me sometimes when, people don't notice that sometimes the best person to execute something is someone who's been executing those things and has the experience to do it versus relying on someone who's only ever created the strategy around it.
Right.
So I guess I want to ask a very specific point, because in my mind, in every company I've been at, whenever we start talking about strategy, one of the topics that inevitably comes up has to do with the postmortem after a project, right? And after you've either successfully or failed to execute the strategy. And to be honest, usually the postmortems happen, when the project did actually fail, went completely south and just it didn't work out, despite how amazing everyone thought the strategy was, and hence the motivation, right, for the postmortem. Let's figure out what went wrong. So from what you found and what we talk about in the book, what do you think are some of the early warning signs that leaders miss before they end up in one of those postmortems to look back at a failure?
Yeah, it's about validating that strategy with a variety of people up front. It's funny, one of the techniques I talk about in the book is to use a pre-mortem. So the idea there is that you imagine that it horribly failed. And then you apply that same mindset that you do in the postmortem by looking back and go, okay, if it really did fail horribly, what would have gone wrong? What are the things we should look at more deeply? And I think there's a difference between that and contingency planning. Contingency planning all the time is you're looking at sort of logistical things that could go wrong and dealing with it there. But in the pre-mortem, you're looking at strategic things. What just did not go the way we expected? It forces you to go back and look at where do we make assumptions, and are those assumptions valid? So that's a really good technique. Another technique I love to use is called the 6 thinking hats. And that was created by this guy, Edward de Bono. And it's a really cool technique because what it does is it requires each person in the room to put on a hat, a metaphorical hat, but each of those hats represent a perspective. So what's our optimistic perspective about this? What's our pessimistic perspective about this? What might be innovative about what we're doing? There's 5 hats because one of them is a facilitator hat. What's good about that, though, is oftentimes you'll get all those perspectives in a meeting when everybody's arguing about them because one person has each perspective. Here it forces every person to have the same perspective at the same time. So the person who's naturally negative has to put on the optimistic hat also, and vice versa. And what that does is it starts to open people's eyes to things that they've assumed and they've, sort of expected without really deeply thinking into it. And that level of validation helps you find those holes early so that you don't end up in that terrible postmortem.
So it really opens up kind of a new type of communication, I guess, between all the stakeholders when you're in a sense forced to think about it in someone else's terms.
Yeah, exactly. And that, by the way, that creates a lot of bonding amongst the team too, because people, the naturally optimistic person who is forced to be negative now all of a sudden has some sort of empathy for the person who's negative.
Yeah, right.
It's a little bit the opposite too. And so those kind of things really help. Yeah.
And sometimes, I'd say that it almost validates like giving you permission to be negative or giving yourself permission to be optimistic when you really are typically negative and you're not spending money and I'm not writing the check and everything's going to go wrong, right? Like there is that person where like during non-work hours, they might be very optimistic, but they know their role.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah. And to your point about permission, that's important too, because especially if the boss is in the room or whatever, people have a hard time being negative, but when the boss is inviting you to be negative, there's another technique I have in the book my friend Amber Taylor used to use called a proposal to hate. And she would put out her early draft and she'd say, this is a proposal to hate. Like, tell me what's wrong with it.
Yeah.
And
that's great.
Again, that gives psychological safety for people to be able to say that. So and that goes a long way because if they don't have that, you end up plowing ahead with something that nobody believes in.
Right.
Yeah. And even just asking is really setting up that I don't want to just hear yes and get things pushed through. I want to hit pause and I want to actually solve.
Right.
Because
the goal is to actually create something. No. It's not only is it not always the case, it's honestly, in my experience, rarely the case. and that's why most strategies fail. Or it's one of the reasons.
Well, you argue that writing the strategy is actually the first step of execution. I'm in the middle of a strategy build at the moment. Where do leaders get this wrong? School us.
What I define as the strategy trap in the book is when leaders get all enamored with the idea and the presentation of the idea, and they forget about all the conditions that it takes to create something that humans can actually execute. When you think about strategy as this precursor to execution, you're setting yourself up to go right into the strategy trap, because all you're doing is talking about the idea. When you change your mindset and you say, okay, we're going to start execution, and the first step is writing the strategy, you've already put yourself in the mindset to say, like, okay, how is this thing going to actually be executed? And you start to have to put in places for validation, like we just talked about. You start to have to think about how you're going to really clearly communicate this and explain it, and what are the steps along the way. In the book, I talk about the 6 C's, of execution, which is a system I talk about in the book. But if you think about that whole system and strategy being part of that whole system, then you are holistically thinking about what you've got to deliver. And that's why I think it's so critical to think of it that way.
Yeah, so often in like large retail organizations or even smaller ones, strategies are built in small circles of leaders in small conference rooms and then rolled out like a gorgeous finished product with a big bow.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's down to the rest of the organization, and it doesn't really work.
No.
Why is this a recipe for failure?
It's because, as I was mentioning, it hasn't been validated. It hasn't been pressure tested by people who are actually going to make it happen. A lot of times you haven't even tested if the people that have to execute it even understand it. And
right.
There's some stats I put in the book that in a lot of companies, people don't even know what the strategy is. They failed the most simple test that everybody in the company actually knows the strategy. And when you do it all in a small group of people who've spent all this time on it, they also lose sight of the fact that other people did not spend all that time on it. When you're like really in it, you don't see these things. I have this thing, a concept I've talked about for years. I call it the tree stump theory. And the way it goes is like, imagine you walk into a conference room and there's a big tree stump on the table. And you're like, what's up with the tree stump? And someone gives you this really compelling reason why it's there. And you go, oh, okay. And then you come in the next day and you see the tree stump, but you don't ask about it anymore. A few 3, 4, 5 days later, you come in, you don't even see it anymore. Yet anyone who walks in the first time is like, what the hell's up with
the tree stump here?
But if you have a small group of people and they spend all this time creating the strategy, there's tree stumps in there that they don't see anymore.
Right.
And when they unleash that in the organization, people are like, what the hell? And that's where you get yourself into lots of trouble.
What does that look like on a P&L when it essentially all goes wrong?
Well, often there's a lot of money put into that strategy. And that ends up being a giant cost with no return on it, or very limited return. So Harvard Business Review put something out that said that like strategies leave a ton of money on the table, failed strategies, anywhere from 60 to 100% could have gained 60 to 100% more if they'd actually executed the strategy instead of the way they did. So, you're talking about tons of revenue left on the table, tons of cost going out the door, all because you didn't take the time to set it up correctly to be executable. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. And are there things that you hear from others that sounds like a great idea to, drive execution from a great strategy, but when the execution starts, it turns out like, oh, that was a terrible idea?
I think, I'm going to be careful I say this, but I think a lot of times it comes in the form of best practices. And you'll get a lot of, particularly coming from, the consultant types or so. They'll come in with some best practice that isn't relevant to the organization you're in, or not exactly. I mean, I think best practices you can use as a guideline, but if you try to just exactly emulate some averaged out best practice that came across a number of McKinsey clients or something, you can't force that in. You have to adapt things to the organization you're in. And I think that's where a lot of problems happen for sure.
I think we're also approaching a time where throw some best practices out the window, create something new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Build a new standard, just because that's the way it has been and it's worked in the past doesn't mean that's going to work in the future. And it's time for change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I agree. And I mean, if most strategies fail, then I don't know that we should be relying on the best practice.
Right. Maybe they're not the best after all.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of raises that question.
Yeah. Most common practices. Maybe.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. It may be common, but not necessarily best.
You heard it here first, folks. Go against the grain. Your book is written from an operator's point of view, not the consultant's, which I find refreshing. But what advice do consultants give that sounds right in the room, but essentially falls off once execution starts?
I think that goes back to best practices in some cases, and it just goes to, oftentimes you'll hear, well, it's been done here this way, or it was, we have this past proof point that, again, is not relevant to the current organization. In my experience, every organization operates a little differently. I've been at a bunch of different retailers. I know retail really well, but when I go into a company, it's not the same. They're never the same.
Right.
And sometimes there's things that are the same. I'm working with the Minnesota Timberwolves right now, which is not retail, but there are retail-like things that I can tie to, but there are other things that are totally different. Companies at different stages are different. You just can't peanut butter spread something across everything. And I think too often consultants come in and just try to apply what they've done in the past without taking time to understand the current organization, the current people, the background of the current people, I mean, you can't just assume everybody's had the same background is going to understand things in the same way. So you really have to customize it at every organization in order for it to be as effective as it can be.
See that especially with retail, because nobody was going to school for retail. Nobody was getting a degree. I mean, it's possible now, but it wasn't. So you really do have, this entire company filled with people from different backgrounds, different skill sets, different training, different expertise, and kind of all coming together to do this thing.
Yeah.
And, I think it makes so much more sense by taking those types of things in consideration, because you're right. Nobody went to school for retail.
Right. Yeah. And the people who went to school for retail that are most effective at it are the ones that their school was working in the store, and they really
right.
When exactly. All these decks and strategies and all that hit the customer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, by the time that trickles all the way down to the floor, it's a joke.
Right. But when it comes from people, when it comes from people who started in the stores, it's a lot better.
That's right.
They understand the nuance of that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That realistic reality of what can and cannot be executed or delivered is much more clear. It's much more aligned.
Yeah. And that's so one of the C's in the book is capacity, by the way. And I think this is where companies fall down all the time too, because they have all these ideas and then they try to dump them on the existing business without making any room for it. And you just said that, Casey. Right. How am I going to do this with what time?
Right.
If you can't carve out the space for it to happen, good luck.
Right.
Seeing it.
I'll never get executed.
Going to,
Yeah. Exactly. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the 6 C's. You've mentioned them a couple of times. Let's dig into that framework that you have in the book and maybe go through some of the tactics that are related with it. But then I saw you also divide them into 2 phases, setting the stage and showtime. So can you talk a little bit about that and explain, what breaks when leaders skip the first phase or go straight to showtime, which we see happen a lot with a lot of strategies. So talk us through the 6 C's.
Yeah. So like you said, I break it in 2 phases, set the stage and showtime. Within each are 3 C's. In set the stage, it's co-creation. We've been talking about that a little bit. It's clarity and capacity. So with each of those, co-creation is all about bringing people together, different levels, getting alignment, validation, and then ultimately commitment. That's all comes in the co-creation stage. Then you get to clarity, and clarity is about How do you simplify the message and make it meaningful to people and make it understandable for people? And you got to spend a lot of time doing that. Otherwise, all that work you just did is going to be for naught because people don't get it.
Right.
Then you get to capacity. Like I was just talking about, you have to create space for it. All too many organizations I've been in, people say things like, look, we're just going to have to build the plane while we're flying it. And I absolutely hate that statement, because if you give that any thought whatsoever, you would go, hey, would you get on a plane while it's still being built? I wouldn't.
Yeah.
And so like what you're actually saying is we're going to put you, team, in the most dangerous possible situation. Go. And it's just crazy. So we can't do that. We have to carve space for it. So then we get into Showtime. And as you said, Ricardo, sometimes people just jump straight to that. And that is when you start to implement it. But it's not like you just throw it out there and let it go. The 3 C's in Showtime are communication, coordination, and coaching. In communication, I have a mantra in there. I talk about early, loud, and continuous. Communication, first of all, you got to set the stage for the change you're going to make. That should happen before you're even putting a strategy.
Yeah.
Help people understand why we need change. Then it's loud. You've got to break through all the noise in the business that's going on and make sure people understand it. Continuous is about repetition and reinforcement. There's something called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. This old psychologist did the study, and he showed that we forget 90% of what we've learned 30 days later without reinforcement. So we'll forget almost everything if it's not reinforced. Yet many times people announce a strategy once and walk away, right? You can't do that.
Yeah.
The last C is coaching, which is a specific aspect of leadership. And coaching is this act of leadership where you're, working on the culture, you're motivating people, you're creating incentive, you're pivoting and making decisions in the moment. And that's a stage that I think it needs to be very intentional, very thoughtful, because that's how you're taking the team through actually bringing this thing to life. So that's the 6 C's in a nutshell.
Everybody snag this book because you're going to
Yeah.
You're going to need a highlighter.
Absolutely.
You've run P&Ls at Nike, Sur La Table, Borders, and Tower Records. Well, is there a moment where the strategy looked solid on paper, but execution exposed a hidden assumption that nearly sank it all?
Yeah.
Spill the tea.
Yes, it's happened for sure. One that I think about the best is when we were building Borders Rewards loyalty program. We had a lot of ideas. We built it with an executive team. We sort of put it out there. Thankfully, we at least put it in some test stores, but we put it out and it just failed miserably. And we talked to customers and asked them what they thought about it. We also talked to employees, booksellers, we cost them, and asked them what they thought of it. By and large, all those people hated it. But we found some customers who liked it. And what we were able to trace back is they talked to a bookseller who liked it and who understood it. And that's when something hit me that I should have known the whole time, coming up from being inside stores and starting on the ground floor. We did not spend enough time helping the booksellers understand why this would be good for the customers. I should have known that because when I was in the store, I didn't care that much about what corporate thought. I cared about the person who's standing right in front of me.
Yeah.
So what we ended up doing is we dug into that, spent more time on it, even modified the program a little bit, spent time with booksellers so we could understand what they felt would resonate with customers. And then we came back out with a very different program, but more importantly, how we communicated that program. And so we actually gave booksellers, they got their own brochure. This was a while back. We still had brochures and stuff, but they got a brochure that the theme was a program you'll be proud to share. And the whole context of it was about here's why you're going to love sharing this with the customer and why they're going to love it. And we developed that by talking to booksellers and understanding how they talk to customers and what they knew would be meaningful. And then it went gangbusters. I mean, we expected the first year, we had a stretch goal of 6 million members. But we ended that year with 16 million members. And that was because the booksellers were into it. I mean, they liked it and they told people about it.
Yeah, so I like that example. As you're going through it, I'm already seeing in my mind which C's at what points. Like there was at the beginning, right? It looked like there was not enough co-creation.
Yeah.
what you were highlighting, right? And the message wasn't clear, so the clarity wasn't there.
Yeah.
So then usually, which is why no one at first liked it for that initial version. And you immediately see how once you brought those people in and they helped you clarify what do people actually want in this program, and you co-create it with them, now suddenly you've gotten to that Showtime phase and you can see how everyone's motivated to execute as a starting point, where originally it's almost like you had to overcome everyone's obstacles, right, to get the execution going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it. I love that, actually. I might have to use that, Ricardo.
Yeah.
You never want your strategy to be something you have to overcome people to
right,
deliver.
Exactly, yeah. It should be a sign, right? If you already are seeing so many obstacles you have to overcome to get anyone to accept it that as a strategy, that should be a warning sign, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. So
I'm stealing that.
Okay, yeah. There's no charge for that.
Sharing is caring.
That's right. Sharing's caring. So I'm just kind of thinking through. So for anyone else listening to this conversation or thinking about how they're going to launch a new strategy, what's an example, like one decision they should be making before the kickoff meeting, right? Where they're going to start to almost like, you always see there's the moment when there's an announcement of this new strategy. But before you get to that point, right, what are some of the things that you want to make sure everyone should know that they're doing and thinking about before they actually have that kickoff?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you should do is make sure you're super clear on the problem. Before we start solving and creating a new strategy, what problem or problems are we solving? And does everybody see them the same way?
Mm-hmm.
You start to galvanize around that. By the way, that's stuff you can use when I was talking about communicating early. Now you can start to even use that to communicate more broadly. Hey, here's issues we're facing that we're going to start working on. So getting clear on the problem, again, co-creating, but making sure that co-creation group is not a homogeneous set of senior leaders who aren't connected to the people who are actually going to execute it. Bring other people in. Sometimes you have to start that co-creation. Usually you have to start it with a smaller group of people, but have layers of validation periods. Start with that core idea, like Amber had, the proposal to hate, and take that out and talk to people about it. Do 6 thinking hat sessions with a variety of people in a variety of areas so that you're really getting that deep thinking brought into the strategy to round it out. Doing that kind of stuff early really sets you up for creating something that's going to be executable. So that's where I think you got to start.
Yeah. We hear so much about things that leaders want to increase the speed at which they do things, right, in their operations and business. And I'm kind of wondering, if you were meeting with someone and kind of reviewing the whole approach with the 6 C's and everything, do you get leaders that kind of almost, in a sense, push back and say, but isn't that going to slow us down? Do you get that kind of response?
Yes, of course, because everybody's type A, including me. I want to go fast.
Right. Yeah.
But here's the thing. Like, I talked to all those people, right? 60 plus people. The thing I heard the most overall was you have to slow down to speed up. I heard that all the time. And I think it's right, because here's the thing. If you don't slow down and do some of these things we talked about and set the stage and really sort of put a plan together, you're going to slow down anyways later, just in a much worse way. Things are going to fall apart. The strategy's not going to work. You do it reworking. You're going to have people quit, pissed off or whatever. So take time up front to slow down. I just think about it like if you're on a windy road, right? You have to slow down as you're entering in these curves or you're going to wreck.
I accelerate for the curve.
Well, no, but Casey, that's the thing. But you slow down into the curve,
but you accelerate out
of it, right? And that's what it is. So you don't end up in a ditch. I don't want you to end up in a ditch.
It's a great example. Yeah, great analogy.
Many people asked to get out of the car.
Note to self, don't drive with Casey.
Don't let Casey drive. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense because there's so many times that you hear about leaders who want to go so fast and they may go fast and save that time up front to get to the execution. Yeah. But if you rush through the execution, all you're going to do is lose time afterwards because you're going to have to go into a recovery plan, right? Because now that if it doesn't work, you've failed and now you have to recover. So what about all the time that you're going to spend on that could have been spent up front, to your point, in the early phase before the execution, right? In the first 3 C's, so that you got it right to begin with.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. And it really doesn't mean like no action. I mean, by all means, get started on co-creation and go quick with that. Get people together, create the time so people can get in there and go. The key is, do you want to get to your result faster or not? Or do you just want to start faster? Because if you want to get to the result faster, you should slow down in order to speed up later.
Yeah.
Well, and
that makes sense. Yeah.
Usually when I talk to people about it, that tends to resonate, because in the end, it's about the result, not about the, the action.
Yeah. Otherwise, the action is just a lot of wasted activity.
Right. Which happens, as you know, a lot in many companies.
That's right.
And this is where we keep going back to consultants, right? Because they're not busy all day. So the operators are fucking busy.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a lot of time to set aside for like planning and big brain thinking, right? Because you get in the weeds very often. But, as a culture shift, I think it's really important, especially now as we're coming into more AI. We have to have everybody to have time set aside on a weekly and monthly basis to just think and work on the strategies. I can't tell you how many strategy builds I've seen that nobody went back to during the quarter. We just do it. It's out. And then I update the results. We never looked at it. Yeah. Is anything off the rails?
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. In fact, in the coaching section of the book, I talk about this concept from an author named Dov Fromman, and he said you have to plan for slop time is what he called it. And basically what he said is like actually plan specific time designed to think. And you should have that. Everybody should have that. Leaders for sure, everywhere, at every level should have that, because that's how you use that time to prepare yourself to be better rather than just action all the time. Right. That is completely undirected and is just noise.
Yeah.
It's very important culture shift that I'm hearing more about. And I hope that it does. It is something that really impacts the industry this year. Or brain time, and it'd be okay. But you're going to spend 2 hours, you're going to learn something, you're going to read something, you're going to just think about your business, think about your plan, think about what could be better, and go drop a meeting on somebody else's calendar to say, hey, to discuss this initiative or this strategy and come back to you with something, we need that time.
We absolutely do.
Yeah. Is that cultural aspect in any organization? Is that one of the big obstacles that cause people to fall into the strategy trap because of the company culture?
Absolutely, company culture. And you can, as you're implementing a new strategy, you need to be really mindful about culture and even where you want to shift and change culture, because culture is how people act. I mean, people act on incentives, really. And incentives come from culture. I think of incentives in 3 ways. There's financial incentives, which was what most executives only talk about financial incentives. And they help in some ways, but not in most day-to-day ways. They largely help on longer, big picture, particularly in the jobs we're talking about. I mean, if you're on the manufacturing or you're a salesperson or something, you have incentives that you can realize every day, so they matter. But a lot of other jobs, that's not the case. But 2 other types of incentives matter every day. One of them is social incentives. What are you getting recognized for at work, or by your boss or by your peers? I mean, where does people see each other? And, are we competing with each other? Are we working with each other? How are we sort of tied together? Those social incentives drive daily behavior. And then the third one is, I call it convenience incentives, because we humans tend to gravitate to whatever's easier. Right. So as you're sort of thinking about things, how do you make the most desired behavior the easiest thing to do? And if you do that, you will get more of that, Make it harder, which we do a lot of times. You throw all this bureaucracy in there or something like that. Then you've made the desired behavior harder. Good luck getting it. Is kind of the way I think.
Right. That's a great point. So it almost feels like we're doing a disservice having gone this long into a conversation in retail and business without talking about AI. given where we are this year. So I kind of feel like I have to ask you the question, because I imagine in any organization that you go in and talk about the 6 C's and how to avoid the strategy trap, someone in the room is going to look at you and say, okay, but Kevin, if we use AI in this phase, doesn't that keep us out of the strategy trap?
The strategy trap is about how you work with humans, for starters.
Right.
I think AI is a tool, it's not a strategy. You can't make it a strategy. It's a tool you use along the way. So I think that you can use AI to help you in many of these situations. I mean, you want to make your strategy clearer? Yeah, you should probably try to use AI to tell you where you've made it completely hard to understand.
Right.
I think you can use it for tools like that. You can use it for analysis. You can use it to help you craft different communication plans for sure. So by all means, use it, but it's not the answer to this kind of thing. And it will not keep you out of the strategy trap. And if you go into it thinking that it's going to be your magical solution, you're going to crash harder into the strategy trap, in my view.
Yeah.
You still need to do all these things for the people, as long as maybe actually, I was going to say it until you have an army of agents, but I don't know if you've seen some of all this stuff going on with agents, but the reality is agents kind of act like humans. If you are unclear with an agent, guess what? It's not going to do what you want either.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. It can only do however well you explain to it what to do. Right.
Right. So you still, even in working with AI, you need to do a lot of these things in order to be clearer to an agent to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great point.
Clarity.
Yeah. So important.
Oh my gosh. Clear instructions, not just like make double rainbows over what.
It's hard though, because we humans are really crappy about communicating.
Mm-hmm.
These days you can't even get somebody with an iPhone to use a word because we just send like an emoji or like,
right.
You don't need to text anymore.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. I don't
even and if you send it in a text, everything's abbreviated.
Yeah. Right.
Terrible communicators. So I think that is a challenge for our audience. We can all be better communicators by the end of this year. It's time to start practicing. There's always room for improvement there, right? Kevin, this is a timely topic. It is Q1, and there's still time to make some edits. So it's a readable book. It's not 650 pages.
I tried to make it fun too, hopefully, and helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love this notion of focusing on the execution of the strategy and realizing that's where strategies fail, not necessarily because it was a bad strategy, and that even the best strategies can fail in the execution and it doesn't work. I think we have a lot of opportunity this year to really build out thoughtful strategies, learn how to make time for it, and integrate that brain time to even just understand who needs to be in the room and what the heck am I going to do with AI?
Right.
There you go.
So thank you for sharing your experience, your knowledge with us and our audience.
Thank you
and
for having me.
everyone out there, go buy Kevin's book, The Strategy.
Right away. Yes.
Why companies fail at execution and how to get it right.
That's right. We'll at least have a link to it to make it easy for everybody in the show notes. There you go. Everybody rush out and get that right now. There's so much more you can get from that, just going even deeper than what we talked about today. Kevin, thanks so much for spending this time with us. I know we could probably talk for a few more hours on this because there's just so much more to understand, right, about how to do this the right way and how not to fall into that strategy trap.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So if anyone in the audience wants to go deeper and maybe wants to actually actively get your help to understand how they can better execute their own strategies in their business, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, you could probably go to my website, which is Mistere Advisory, Mistere Advisory, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with everybody there too.
All right. Excellent.
Or follow him on TikTok, where I do.
Oh, right. Yes. I started my TikTok channel, so you can try that.
That's right.
Still a newbie there, but I'm doing my best.
Hey, we're all newbies.
That's right.
Thanks, Kevin. Well, with that, Ricardo, I'd say this episode has a bow on it.
It does.
How much did you love this episode? Drop us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Good Pods, and hit subscribe so you never miss an update. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe before you go. I'm Casey Golden.
Follow Retail Razor on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to our Substack for highlights and bonus content in your inbox. For transcripts and guest info, head to retailrazor.com. Retail Transformers is part of the Retail Razor Podcast Network. I'm Ricardo Belmar.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, stay sharp, be bold, and keep transforming retail. This is the Retail Razor Retail Transformers.